then that'll be best so I know where to look because there's so many screens I'll be monitoring. So to get started, I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Logan Cochran, and I'm at Jamiat Hamad bin Khalifa in Qatar, and I am in the College of Public Policy. Here, I'm currently teaching a course on ethics, and hopefully today we'll share with you a little bit about the intersection between ethics, technology, and future innovation. I was hoping, and I'm still hoping, but so it'll be the two of us, and maybe Abdelhadi, I can pull you in as well, to have a discussion about some of these issues, because I think that's where a lot of the really interesting discussions emerge and the richness of our learning comes out if we're able to share some of our ideas together. Maybe also as a bit of a background of myself, I'm currently at university and I'm currently teaching in a graduate program in the College of Public Policy, but I come from a background of being a practitioner. So I've worked in the NGOs, in government, and as a consultant for various intergovernmental organizations. So when I think about ethics and when I teach ethics here in the College of Public Policy, it takes a very applied perspective. In some cases, it could be very philosophical, and that's great if you enjoy it. In my teaching and experience with ethics here in the College of Public Policy, we take a much more applied approach to policymaking we're engaging with on a day-to-day basis here with our students and in the state of Qatar. So let's get started. Here you have a scenario, and if you've seen this, great, but I'll ask, I think, Abdelhadi, we don't need the poll for now. We can just ask for all of us to give our answers. In this scenario, you've got a self-driving car. And the self-driving car is going down the road, and we are programming the car to decide what to do. And you have two scenarios where something unfortunate is going to happen, but the car needs direction by our programming guidance about what to do. So scenario one on your left is the car is coming down the road and it could swerve to the right and go into the barrier. As you can see, there are barriers on the sides, so it can't go anywhere else, either straight or change lanes and into the barrier. And those unfortunate skull signs mean that the passengers of this car do not survive, but the animals that are crossing the street in the crosswalk do survive. And in scenario two, on the other side of your screen, the car drives into the animals and they have the skull signs signifying that they will not survive that accident. So what should we tell the car to do? Which scenario would you tell the car to take if you are the programmer of this self-driving car? So I think we have Abdelhadi. I'll force you as well to join us. Minar, if you want to put in the chat 1 or 2, which you would tell it to do.
Okay, just a second.
Wonderful, thank you. Abdelhadi, we'll wait for you. Okay, wonderful. So if you've seen this, you might know where I'm going already. If you haven't, then here we go. We won't do all the scenarios, but here's one more. These get increasingly difficult. So here we have the self-driving car with no passengers, and straight ahead we have 2 people in the crosswalk, and you see the right is the walking light is red for don't cross, and you have an elder and an adult. And in the other lane, you have a child and an adult. So we need to instruct the car what to do. Again, the barriers are on the sides. And if you're familiar with the system, it's called the moral machine. It was developed by MIT to help us think about some of the ethical questions related to things like self-driving cars. So in this scenario, do we instruct the car to scenario 1 or scenario 2? So there is, this is great that you mentioned that, Abdul Hadi, to stop the car. So we have, if you use this, and I encourage you, if you find this discussion that we're about to have interesting, I encourage you to check out this and other resources available to you. But on the MIT Moral Machine, below the picture, there's actually a description. You can click for more information, and it doesn't allow you to find a way out. There's no time to stop, and there's no way to turn another direction, or so sorts of things. They make it very specific. And if you've ever taken an applied ethics class, you'll see that this is quite common in ethics. For example, there's a very famous thought experiment called the trolley experiment, where there's a trolley going down a track and it's about to hit 5 people, and you can change the direction of the trolley to go down another track, but it would hit 1 person. And so we need to make the decision: do we save 5 lives and get ourselves involved in the loss of another life, or do we do nothing and have 5 lives be lost and not participate? So there's all these thought experiments that philosophers and ethicists have thought about to put us in the difficult decision-making scenario where we have to decide between 2 problematic or difficult or negative outcomes. And this is what the moral machine at MIT, looks like this, if you want to jot it down, does for us in thinking. So if we think about the answers that you gave just now, in scenario 1, we can see that generally people who answer this question, and for us as well, that the dominant opinion was that human life is greater than animal life. And so if the difficult decision is between human life and animal life, the car should preserve human life over animal life. And in the second, we had another scenario where there is going to be loss of human life. And here we saw factors. If I just go back for you so you could see, that everyone is in a crosswalk, but some people are crossing when they shouldn't be crossing. So in this case, we see that life should be preserved towards those who are following the rules and regulations of the road in this case. So as you can see, we're starting to build ourselves some principles which would guide this self-driving car to make difficult decisions. And as you all know, there are lots of self-driving cars already under development or on the road in some places. So these decisions have already been made. The choices about what cars should be doing or how they should respond. You can imagine a scenario where you're on a highway and you're in the middle lane of 3 or 4 or 5 lanes, right? If you're driving from Dubai to Abu Dhabi or something, they're multi-lane highways, and there's an accident directly in front of you, and the car may need to decide, do I continue straight into the accident in front of me? Do I swerve left and hit someone? Do I swerve right and hit someone? And how does that decision being made? Previous to self-driving cars, humans were making this choice, and they were doing it in the moment. So usually there weren't very many legal repercussions from that decision because it was not an intentional decision that you made beforehand. It was an accident and so on. What's potentially different now with self-driving cars and the emergence of various forms of technology, we can talk about many other types like automated weapons that are in drone form or in tank form or in other forms that are making decisions to shoot to kill without the input of humans. So this isn't only a self-driving car question. Here, we grapple with these difficult scenarios, but what makes it different is that we're programming them well in advance, as opposed to making it in the moment of an emergency. And this is where legal responsibility for governments, for companies, car manufacturing companies, and so on, is different than what it was before. And these are the types of ethical questions that I think are useful for us and you as technology entrepreneurs and developers in particular, and for us as policymakers to work with you on, so that we think about some of these questions in advance. So again, the moral machine is there. It has a whole bunch of scenarios. You can go and check it out. And I'll loop back at the end of my presentation to some research that's been done on the results of the moral machine, of what users from around the world have shared as they decided what the car should do on a range of different scenarios. I only shared 2 just to start our conversation. So the tech, as I mentioned, in this case, cars, can be programmed once we make those decisions that we just made and gave the car some principles to operate around, that it can follow the decisions and the principles that we give it. So what could go wrong? I opened the floor. If you have any thoughts, so what could go wrong now if we said that human life is greater than animal life, and those following the rules should be prioritized over those who don't follow the rules? Those were two principles we just potentially put on the table. Now, what could go wrong with those? If you want to open your mic, feel free. If you want to type, feel free. Abdelhadi, what do you think? I can put you on the spot. What could anything go wrong if we program these principles? Unanticipated, unexpected things. All right, well, let's explore some of those, what they could be. So here's one example. In our first principle, we potentially thought about giving the self-driving car the operating principle of prioritize human life over animal life. And underneath some of this decision-making in the technology, there are a whole bunch of sensors that are looking around to determine what is the road, what is the wall, what is another vehicle, and so on and so forth. And these are often being served by a number of other types of technologies that have been developed. One of which is forms of recognition. So recognizing, we have these different tools to recognize objects. So one example that we're all familiar with is facial recognition. We want to recognize faces. So these cars need to be able to recognize various objects. And again, going back to our first principle, we said that human life is greater than animal life. But what if the systems underneath that to recognize and distinguish between human and non-human were not working correctly, and decided that certain humans were not actually human, or were classifying certain humans as non-human? So we can see some of the ethical implications of giving a principle which may sound good, but in practice, we can see, and we have seen, that many of the systems that we build as technology entrepreneurs and innovators and promoters can have negative unintended consequences. In this case, we see the unfortunate case of certain people from certain backgrounds being classified as non-humans. And this has happened, I'm not trying to point out any particular tech companies, but it's happened to some tech companies that have significant resources to be able to deal with some of these biases. Now you might wonder, how does that happen? Unfortunately, we've got a lot of excellent research, and I can point it to you. I won't go through it to you today. I'm just going to give some examples of where you can follow up on some of this research. But Dr. Joy has been doing wonderful research, and I hope you've heard about her or seen her on YouTube or her various talking engagements, trying to analyze these various systems and uncover the biases that exist within them. So here you see facial recognition systems from a variety of platforms, IBM on the right, Amazon on the left, and a whole number of others that she and the Algorithmic Justice League have worked on to show that there is bias within these systems, such that you can see facial recognition works really well if you are a Caucasian male, and it comparatively works poorly if you are a woman of color. And you can see the variation both in the IBM system and in the Amazon system, that the error rate is significantly different. And here is where we have one of those, and we'll look at a number of them, unintended negative consequences that our principles may be applied through these technology systems in ways that we didn't think that they would be. So that's one example. I'll give you another example that's maybe closer to home. If some of you are students or recently or had children who are studying during the pandemic, a lot of us rapidly shifted into online learning. And we had to figure out how can we continue our education and reform our education experience during the pandemic while we were at home. So if K to 12, if you are a parent and had kids, you know that that went to the home setting. And that included not only learning, but also assessment. And so your exams had to be recreated and refigured in a new way. The same thing with university and a whole bunch of other examinations that we would have typically done in person. Well, this didn't just stop there. We saw that these same systems, where you see the facial recognition on your screen now, also translated into the online experience of students trying to take exams. If you happen to be a student of color and you were using an online learning system where you would take a test virtually instead of in person because we were stuck at home in the pandemic, many were being identified as cheating because the system didn't recognize them as being human. And these tended to be students of color where the error rates were much higher. And you saw some of the examples from the previous slide. I'm giving you this example to say that many facets or many components and aspects of our life are being influenced by this technology development. And throughout my spiel here for the next little bit of time with you is to really emphasize the important role of ethics. And I think we need to be excited about the great work that you're doing as entrepreneurs and as innovators and tech developers. And certainly we'll talk about, great cases where these technologies have done amazing things. So I'm not opposed to technology, but I think we also need to think about the ethical dimension that they exist within, the unintended consequences that might emerge, and how we can best mitigate those unintended negative consequences. Particularly for us living in our region, we're neighbors here in Qatar with you, where there are specific ways in which people live, dress, go to work, interact with one another, through which these systems may not be well trained compared to a technology developed, for example, in Silicon Valley, which uses photo databases and video databases that are predominantly of a different way of dress. So if we think about, here's a picture from Qatar, that how well are the sensors recognizing the way people dress here in our region as being humans and identifying them not to be hit by vehicles or prioritizing them and so on and so forth. And this, again, doesn't just apply to cars. We can also think that this matters in all sorts of lives where these new systems are being employed from everywhere, from the airport to the library and so on. So I think having contextually relevant ethical perspectives is particularly important, so that we know how, if we import technologies that are developed to work really well in a particular cultural setting, that we ensure that they also work as well in our setting, where people may live, work, dress, act, engage differently than the systems they were developed within. And this is interesting. And I've worked with students here in the state of Qatar, and we've seen that these systems are not particularly well trained for recognizing how people dress and act in our region. And this is an important ethical dimension. As we said, it can have real life consequences if this is in a vehicle, for example, recognizing or not recognizing people as being human or not human. And of course, you can think of other examples of where this would apply. Great. So this technology is already available, self-driving cars, the virtual examinations, and so on. So maybe you already know about this, and if you do, wonderful. There are future directions of this technology, and hopefully you're one of the ones working on the future direction of innovations in tech. So one of the things that we could use or could think about, or we can use ethics for, is anticipating what some of those challenges may be and building them into the way in which technology is developed, taking these ethical perspectives from our design phase, if you like. So what are some of this? We've seen some of the challenges where new AI systems are being utilized to be able to predict, I know this sounds like a movie, but this is real, to be able to predict criminal activity or people who are more prone to commit criminal actions. So this is also interacting with some of the inbuilt biases of these systems, or the inbuilt assumptions about how certain people engage or what certain actions may imply, and if that is a signifier of potential future criminality. And we see in a real case where this has been applied, where sort of algorithmic forms of policing have been applied, that these biases have real world consequences for people. These services are supposed to serve people and make their lives better and safer. And in some cases, if we don't see these inbuilt biases, they can do the opposite. So I think, again, this is where ethics is particularly important, and having a strong ethical thought process from design and exploring all the potential ways in which we need to mitigate risks. I'll give you one more example. I won't take over for too long, is thinking about the expansion of the surveillance by state and non-state. You know, the videos and cameras are everywhere. And the way in which privacy, this has implications for privacy. Will we be able to protect privacy for ourselves? You've probably seen some of this technology that is scraping the internet for all sorts of imagery, videos, and one is able to search everywhere for where anyone may be at all times. It's kind of like search scraping of all images that have been posted anywhere. And there are some positive use cases for this. If I just give you one quick example that's mentioned in this podcast, and you can check it out if you want to learn more about it, is that policing services are using this to try and solve unsolved cases. And they have done so. For example, they might have only a partial picture of a face as part of their evidence base, and they're not able to connect that with a particular individual, but the mass amount of photo imagery that's available, they're able to have leads using that they previously aren't able to have, and to solve some unsolved cases. On the other hand, you can imagine all sorts of ways in which this technology could be abused and misused. And these are the sorts of things we need to be mindful of. And in some ways, with the provocation of this podcast, is that once all of this is available in the public domain, whether that's images that you posted of yourself and your family on Facebook, or other people posted of you and your family because you were in the background, or you were around, or they were taking a video while they were at Ain Dubai or somewhere in a public sphere, and then they've posted it, you may or may not have control over the images which you are actually in. And at this point, it's quite difficult. There are some companies working to find ways that you'd be able to remove yourself or delete yourself. But for the most part, it's quite difficult to put this privacy back once the privacy doors have been opened. One more big example, I think many of us are watching the trends for young people and their engagement with various new technologies, whether that's social media or other forms, where we see concerning levels of depression, anxiety, even rising rates of suicide around the world, where this becomes of particular concern for our young people. In addition to that, and related to the privacy that we were just talking about, there's so much data being collected about young people. We have to think about, and this is where it becomes a policy and legal question, do we want to have limits and regulations? And should companies be more proactive in protecting the privacy and the rights of minors? People who are under the age of 18. Here you see, one study suggesting that by the time a child turns at the age of 13, that big data will be available about them, upwards of 72 million data points. And that seems particularly, from my perspective, invasive. So much information is available, and you can imagine all sorts: speech, facial expression, purchasing habits, games they play, number of hours watching so-and-so on YouTube or TikTok, or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So much personal data. We've already seen that this has real world consequences for people who may have said things or watched things or visited certain websites for whatever reason, but because of that personal history, have been fired from jobs or not given jobs. And so this isn't just a matter of what happens with this data. It certainly has questions about who should be able to own this data. But there are other consequences I think we need to be mindful of as tech developers. It's great if we find a revenue stream, but there may be other ethical dimensions that we as a company also want to stand for about protecting privacy or child rights and so forth. So have I selected some troublesome examples for my brief provocation with you in the last 30 minutes or so? Definitely. I've taken some of the troublesome examples. And if you want, there are more troublesome examples. I mentioned autonomous weapons before this. There are many other examples that we could take that raise particularly problematic ethical questions. And I've raised some of them here for our discussion. And as I mentioned, there are undoubtedly positive use cases and positive outcomes of the development of these technologies, making people's lives safer, happier, and healthier. So don't misread me. I'm not opposed to technology. What I am supporting is the idea of integrating more ethical thinking from design and implementation, and also thinking about the role of policy and law in ensuring some of these ethics are maintained at the societal level. So technology, as we've mentioned, has intended consequences, developing some service that people enjoy, and it may also have unintended negative consequences. And we need to pay more attention, in my perspective, to the latter, because most of our design focus is on the former. Some service we're trying to develop a new technology for, but maybe we've not explored as much about the negative unintended consequences. We could do this because we want to stand as an ethical company. We could also do this because it makes good business sense, as we've seen a lot of negative outcomes or consequences for companies that have data breaches or their technology has been used in negative ways and so forth. So I think ethics is really critical here. And let me just walk us through, what does an ethical perspective add to this conversation? So I'll give you a brief example. I mentioned the pandemic earlier, and we all went through it. So I can sort of assume that we had a similar experience no matter where you live. And I wasn't sure if we were all going to be from the same place. So I'll give us a brief example about the pandemic. I'll give us two theories. If you're familiar with ethics, wonderful. If you're not familiar with ethics, then I'll give you a brief introduction to two different ethical theories or approaches. So one is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, depending on which theorist you start with, was about maximizing happiness or maximizing pleasure or maximizing utility, maximizing benefit. But this is an ethical approach to decision-making. If you remember earlier, I gave you that example of a thought experiment of the trolley going down a track or a train going down a track, and it's about to crash into 5 people and take their lives. And you can pull the trolley track to have it switch, but it'll kill 1 person instead. The utilitarian answer, typically in this scenario, is that 5 lives are greater than 1 life. And to maximize the benefit of this scenario, we should pull the switch and save the 5 lives to maximize the benefit of that difficult situation that we're in. So this is one ethical theory, which gives us a tool or a way to make difficult decisions. And in this case, you can imagine this being applied all sorts of things, from the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, to your individual daily life. You could have a principle to maximize benefit. I won't go into a ton of detail here, but there are some challenges to this theory, although it sounds nice. If we continue to maximize benefit, it may have negative consequences, for example, on a minority who need particular attention or may not get the similar amount of benefit. If I give you an example here, if we are in the Ministry of Education and we decide that we need to develop a new app for our students, and we only have budget for 1 new app for our students, should we develop a STEM app that will engage with the majority of our students who will be able to benefit by this new STEM app that the Ministry of Education is going to develop? Or should we use that same amount of funds, and we only have a limited amount of funds, to develop an app for children with autism who are much fewer in number, but they really could also benefit by having this app? Now you can imagine the utilitarian approach would probably advocate for the former. to maximize the benefit of that limited resources to support the most amount of people they can with the limited amount of resources they have. What if that decision was made 3 more times, 5 more times, 10 more times, 20 more times? We can see that this comes into somewhat of a utility monster, that it continues to widen inequalities that we may not actually be comfortable with, and we might need another way to think about decision-making. So for contrast purposes, I'll give you a second one, which is a rights-based approach to thinking about what's right, what's wrong, what's just, and what's unjust. So this one, for the sake of simplicity in our brief talk today, is we could think about it from an equality perspective, that everyone has an equal right to something, whether that is healthcare or education. Great, so we've got these 2 theories in our pocket now, utilitarianism and rights-based approach. Now, I told you this is a pandemic example. So in the pandemic, we saw, especially in the early days, many countries were overwhelmed with people needing care, and particularly people needing ventilators. So I'd like for you to imagine that these 3 briefcase-looking medical devices that I just popped up are ventilators. And we are at the hospital. We are the doctors, and we need to decide about who should get care. It's the very beginning of the pandemic. So in walks the door our first 2 patients. One is an elderly patient, and the other person has a diverse ability, in this case, a person in a wheelchair. So what do we do most likely? I see a few more people with us, welcome. Muna Hissa and Hamda on the spot, but what do we do in this case? In most hospital scenarios, we would give these 2 people who need the ventilator. And that would be our decision. In most cases, this would be a decision that would be taken. We have the ventilators, we should use them to give the care that they need. These patients coming through the door, we've assessed them, they really do need a ventilator. So here's where it got difficult. And by the way, this made sense, and we saw this in reality. So the first patients that came through the door were often immunocompromised patients, meaning they had particular other health complications. And so when the pandemic came, they were often some of the first patients that we saw come through the doors. But after that, we saw other people came through the doors. We saw an emergency worker come through the door, and at the same time, an expecting mother came through the door. But we've just used 2 of our ventilators, and we only have 1 left. So what are we going to do? This is a difficult ethical decision. We could give the 3rd ventilator to the expecting mother, and we could use utilitarianism as our theory to say that we want to maximize the benefit of these resources that we have, and 2 lives are greater than 1 life. We could also look at utilitarianism from a different perspective, and we could say that the essential worker who just came through the door serves so many people. And if we lose these essential workers, nurses, doctors, police officers, that society will be harmed. So for maximizing benefit for society at large, maybe we should give the ventilator to the essential worker. And another option is that we could remove the ventilator from one of the first 2 patients and distribute it to the others. So we might make an assessment as doctors and say that one of these patients is not likely to survive. They're still surviving and they're still using the ventilator, but their probability of survival is low. So maybe we take away their ventilator and give it to someone else, knowing that if we remove the ventilator, they will probably not survive. That's one approach, maximizing benefit of resources. Another approach is a rights-based approach. And in this case, we said for simplicity's sake, we'll just call it equality. And in this case, equality of healthcare. So our first 2 patients walked through the door and they got the ventilators, and our next 2 patients walked through the door. And now we are considering these people as equally right to having healthcare. They're both residents or citizens of this nation and equally entitled to having care. So it's not really about maximizing benefit anymore. It's about ensuring everyone has a right to healthcare. And in this case, in the pandemic case, things got really complicated because people kept coming through. In our doors, in our hospital, we had then an adult male and a child come through the door. And we had to make even more decisions because we had no more ventilators. Should we be removing people from ventilators? Should we not? And these were difficult decisions that you saw and we saw were being made in some countries. Ethics help us make these difficult decisions, where we started with the self-driving car, with the issues of privacy and surveillance, with the issues of bias in big data systems, and here in dealing with limited resources in a healthcare setting. These that we just discussed are only two ethical theories. And of course, there are so many other ethical theories. I've got a list coming for you in just a second. But these ethical theories help us better understand what would be the right decision to make in this scenario. I've got a long list. We've covered only two of these, utilitarianism and rights-based. I have a wonderful time with students here at the College of Public Policy going through these theories, not to necessarily adopt one or the other or to argue that one is better or more right than the other, but so that we can understand the decision-making logic of each of these theories, the intended outcomes and the unintended, sometimes negative consequences. And for you as tech developers, you can then think, okay, what would be the just society that we would love to live in? And what kind of technology would put in place the right safeguards about the kind of content young children are exposed to, or if facial recognition software should be utilized in children's applications and that data held and resold by private companies. These are questions that we should be thinking about from a legal and policy perspective as we develop them, but also these conversations more broadly in our society to see what would we like to have as the right ethical decision or the just society we'd want to live in. I mentioned at the very beginning that the moral machine and these decisions with ethical decisions about what the car should do, right lane, left lane, and which accident, there's been some research on this. And I found it quite interesting, and I'll just share with you the visual of it. We won't go into the details. But when people around the world answered those questions, should the car run into the animals or the humans? Should the car run into the people in the crosswalk rightly, or should it run into the people that are violating the rules of the road? What's interesting is that these answers varied by location. And this suggests something we all know, that values, worldviews, ideologies differ from place to place. And yet, some of our policymaking is not done in this way. It may not reflect our local values or our local worldviews or our local perceptions about what theory, if you like, rights-based, utilitarian, or otherwise, should dominate the decision-making for what is right and wrong. In this case, you can see some of the geographic differences about what cars should or shouldn't do. And I think the takeaway here is that our ethics around the world do differ. But if we think about something like the pandemic, the World Health Organization gave us the answer to some of these difficult questions. And for the most part, we all adopted it. And in that case, a lot of the decision-making was utilitarian in orientation. And if you came to some countries, let's say across the Middle East and North Africa, that had an Islamic ethics perspective, some of those decisions were not considered right or just. They were considered unethical. But they were considered unethical from the framework of Islamic ethics. So my question for you, which I will not give you the answer, but for us just to think about, is given that our values differ, and given that our priorities, worldviews, and perspectives differ globally, which the MIT study has shown us, should our policies also reflect that? Here in the state of Qatar, there are some relatively strong protections of privacy about recording in public, for example, video recording in public. So are these particular values about privacy and the right to maintaining your private space ones that we want to protect and have local policymaking and local lawmaking take priority over global lawmaking? And if so, I think to do so, we need to really understand the various different ethical opinions, compare them, contrast them, and see what is the best fit for us, where we live, and the circumstances we face in, and the values that we want to uphold in our society. That's 45 minutes. I wanted to leave a few for your comments, your discussion, any reflections you have. I really would like to appreciate you for taking the time to join me and inviting me to join this hackathon session with TDRA. And if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, they're very welcome in the chat. For those who have joined us, I don't have open the Q&A box. I have opened the chat box. If you have anything to share there, it's very welcome. While you think about your questions, if you have any, Abdelhadi, where can we find the virtual academy? If you want to give us any directions, maybe everybody already knows that.
Yes, I will send you the link.
Wonderful. The last thing, maybe if there are no questions, or if you're typing your question right now, if you're interested in ethics, if this is something that piqued some curiosity that maybe didn't exist and you want to learn more about it, a great place you can begin, there is a course that's offered by a professor from Harvard University. It's called Justice. You can take the course online as like one of these online virtual courses. And it's quite a well done course. I enjoyed taking it myself. And I think it's a great place to get an introduction to a lot of different ethical theories. What I would say about that course is that it's amazing for introducing you to a lot of the ethical theories that are dominant in the global north or in the Euro-West, particularly from the European tradition and ethicists from North America. If you're interested in other types of ethical thinking from other peoples and places and times, then you'll probably need to look for other courses. There are lots of other resources available for that. You can send me a message if you're looking for any particular theory or any resources. In the class that I teach here, we try to have two perspectives in each class. Maybe a perspective, for example, on Islamic ethics, as well as looking at something from the Euro-Western tradition, be that Immanuel Kant or Jeremy Bentham, or some of the big names that you've probably heard about in ethical thinking. We also want to recognize that there are big names from the rest of humanity outside of the Euro-Western tradition who have made amazing contributions as well. With no other questions, I think we can end the session. And thank you for the comment, Hamda. It's very nice to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. Everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Logan, for this beneficial and interesting topic. Actually, the ethics is very important. And thank you. And thank you so much for attendees. Let's see you again, Dr. Logan, in UAE Hackathon. See you again.
Great. Look forward to it.
Thank you.